So I'm going to start with a question just, which is, when you first held the guitar, and did the magic of the guitar sort of immediately make you want to kind of noodle and come up with motives? And did it happen early in your development, your relationship with the guitar? I'll start with David, where you just found yourself improvising, noodling, motive, you writing melodies on the guitar?
That's a really interesting question. Can you all hear me? I don't know. Okay. I don't know how close to hold this thing. I haven't thought about that in a long time. When I started the guitar, I was a folk guitarist. So my first writing was folk songs or popular folk pop folk, whatever you call it, in the style of James Taylor, Joni Mitchell, etc. I think my inclination to write songs didn't happen till after a few years. I think I started when I was 10, and I wrote my first songs when I was 15. And it wasn't quite the romantic thing that you're describing. It was that I was hearing things in my head. It wasn't the guitar so much.
Not so much, right.
It was the music coming from somewhere that needed to get out.
Fred?
I can't recall the first time I ever picked up the guitar, because I think I would have been 8 years old, or something like that. But it didn't happen right away. My first training was strictly as a classical guitarist. But what did happen in my early teens was a couple of rather illustrious studio musicians in New York took me under their wing. And they introduced me to a whole world of mostly folk music, but also one was Harry Belafonte's accompanist, and the other was Leon Bimp, who was a great folk singer also. And so between the two of them, and also they were accompanying the Simon sisters, Carly Simon, and so all of a sudden I was exposed to the world of improvisation and chord changes, and that's when it started for me. About 13.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Gian.
Hello. Well, for me, I would say that the guitar is an incredibly noodly instrument, for lack of a better way of putting it. And I kind of noticed from the first moment when I picked up a guitar, I found myself instinctively noodling on it. And actually haven't stopped to this day. So it's one of those instruments. It's kind of quirky and idiomatic, and once you spend enough time kind of getting to know its quirks and qualms, you discover all of the gems and rewards that make it difficult and challenging, yet also super rewarding. So.
Andrew.
Are all the questions going to be this personal?
Yes, yes. Well, I'm just getting warmed up. Yeah.
Okay. My father and my uncle are both guitarists, so from the beginning, family get-togethers were always filled with folk music. And, to me, the guitar very quickly, even before I could play, became this medium for harmonic accompaniment. All the emotion was reinforced with the guitar. So I started about 6 years old. I would just hold a guitar, and I was watching, and I gradually got the chords, and they realized I was actually playing after a few months. They started noticing, wait a minute, he's playing. So yeah, it was as soon as I could hold it, I wanted to, begin to improvise and compose. Even then, I have some really early compositions when I was about 7.
Really?
So yeah.
Great. I mean, that brings up another question that I know.
They're really bad, but
No. Early. That I know many people ask, do you compose at the guitar? I mean, for instance, Andrew. I mean, are you? Some people feel some pieces they compose at the guitar, some pieces they don't. What's your general, your general modi operandum, as it were? Yeah.
I'm very curious to hear what everyone else has to say, but for me, it's kind of half and half. Of course, holding the guitar and using the idiomatic quality. Some things are just magic on the instrument, and those are springboards, inspirational springboards to create new ideas. The other half I do in my head. I do a lot of writing just thinking about it, while walking around. And I'm curious to see what the ratio is for everyone.
Gian, what do you? Yeah.
Well, it's not very interesting. It's exactly what he said. So
it is interesting.
I mean, a lot of times it'll start on the guitar, and then I kind of, for either because I don't have a guitar with me when I get an idea, it'll continue just on manuscript paper, or napkins, or now even, a pocket recorder, which is now like a little iPhone app, just
Oh, yeah.
bust that sucker out on the train, or else you might forget the idea. So,
Right.
Combination.
When you say just now, you said it starts on the guitar. Does that mean, like we were saying, or improvising kind of, and you just hit an idea that captivates you?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time improvising, so usually that's where it starts. But often it starts without a guitar around. So
Right.
just a rhythm, And I
Yeah.
find that one thing that's really helpful is if there's an idea like a concrete, guitar idea or musical idea that has a melody or a mode or a key or a rhythm or something about it, some kind of profile or personality. If the more I can do to remember that, the more elements of that I can record at a time, the better. So if I don't have anything with me, at least I can analyze it and say, okay, well, actually, that's in 7/8. It's got a syncopated rhythm with, it's the and a 2 and the and a 4, and kind of make this little profile in my head, then I'll actually remember it. Whereas if I go, oh, that's kind of cool, and then,
Right.
it's just gone. Yeah.
Right. Leo Kottke once told me that if you can't remember it the next morning, it's not any good.
I agree with that.
Fred.
I certainly would echo what you two have said. I would add that sometimes, it's almost like there's two parts. There's the organic creative part, and then later on you're just listening in your head and you go, oh, wait a minute, that really shouldn't go there. It needs to go someplace else. So there is that part too, that where you're just hearing it and you're saying that doesn't feel right. But something interesting happened a couple of years ago. I was asked to write a piece for multiple guitars. And I did start on one guitar, and I was just learning to use the software program Sibelius. And so I wrote, the initial, I think, 8 or 16 measures with the guitar in my hand. And then I started entering things with a keyboard. It was the last time I picked up the guitar, because it was just so helpful to just see the score and see, oh, yeah, well, that should imitate that. And I was still hearing it in my head, and I could hear it on the keyboard, but I found it was a relief to actually go to the keyboard, and I found harmonies that I couldn't find on the guitar. So that was like a new thing for me.
Interesting, yeah.
I've changed quite a bit, actually, over the years, evolved in many different ways, but a lot of my music is not for the guitar. So to write on the guitar for the French horn or the cello is not such a great idea. So much of the time I'll work at the piano. I have zero skills with the piano, really nothing. I'm only picking out sonorities basically at the piano. And then very often I will work away from the guitar. As you guys have talked about, for me, I actually spent some years trying to only write away from the guitar.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, and that was interesting, and it's become a sort of a tool that I have now. And then, of course, I often use the guitar, but I try to stay away from it when I can, because my fear is that I might go into finger habits that
That's
are
a
maybe
great point, yeah.
not as interesting as something that comes out of my brain.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm going to switch around here because I have so many questions I actually want to ask you. This concert tonight is called For American Guitar Composers, and there is an emphasis on American, and meaning that you are American, I think. And so I was just interested, in what American musics that have really found their way into your musical language. I'll start with David.
Well, as I mentioned, the folk rock stuff was an early influence, and Laura Nero, another composer who I love very much, and then it quickly became more classically oriented. Charles Ives was a great influence on me pretty early on. I became very enamored of his music, his songs in particular, but the Fourth Symphony really got me.
How old were you then?
Let's see, that was probably 16 or 17. And then, since then, Philip Glass is an important influence. And of the Americans, I would say those are probably the two most important for me.
Interesting, yeah. Fred?
Well, for American composers, I would say definitely Samuel Barber
Right.
and Aaron Copland.
Yes.
And in terms of sound or cultivating an American sound or just having that happen, one pianist in particular, Bill Evans, is like maybe, yeah. But however, Bill Evans, would easily admit that it came right from Ravel and Debussy. So
Right,
I don't know
right.
how American that is, but in
Right.
any case, he made it American.
Yeah.
Herbie Hancock, that Keith Jarrett for sure.
And what period of Herbie and Keith?
Well, for Keith, I would say the solo concerts.
Yeah.
Not that I haven't listened to all his trio stuff, but the solo,
Right.
I love that kind of improvisation. For Herbie, more earlier. Although the stuff like he did with Joni Mitchell more
Yeah,
recently is
yeah.
amazing.
Right,
Everything
right.
he does is amazing. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Keon.
Actually, excuse me, that just reminds me that actually there was quite an important influence on me very early on. When I was 4 years old, I was listening to Duke Ellington and Count Basie records of my parents, and that worked its way in for sure.
Yeah, it's extraordinary who yeah.
Yeah, and then later on, the more advanced jazz guys, Coltrane and Monk and so on. I'm sorry, I'd forgotten about it, but you reminded me. Thank you, Fred.
Keon, you came from such an unmusical household. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
Didn't your uncle write something
I don't-
called In B or something?
I don't know any influential
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah. Do you know anybody? I'll introduce you to some later.
Yeah,
but,
okay.
but feel free to answer.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, man. For those of you that don't know, I grew up in a very musical household. My father is a composer, and so I was exposed to all sorts of, different varieties of music. And he was studying primarily North Indian classical music when I was born. So that not being an American tradition, I'm going to prevent myself from digressing and say Jimi Hendrix was a huge influence on me from the time I was about 11 years old. And does South American count?
Well, in a way, it's open. I mean, but just yeah, because I know that you did your background. So, but
Yeah.
that's just as you like.
Well, I mean, Egberto Gismonti was
Yeah.
was really big for me when I discovered him, in terms of anything, and other South American traditions, and also Lou Harrison was
Of course,
a
Lou
huge
Harrison. Yeah.
for me.
And you knew him, right?
Not well, but I
Okay.
met him and worked with him a little bit.
Did he hear your compositions? Any of your?
I wasn't really composing then. That was right around the time when I met him. Was around the time I started composing.
okay.
So unfortunately not, but
Yeah, he would have loved them.
I hope.
Andy.
It's hard in a way to keep it to American influences. A lot of times the family things, they'd be singing Irish, English, and American folk songs as well, Civil War folk songs, all this broad spectrum of stuff. And then all the other times my father had classical radio playing, so he's just crazy for classical music, so I was really steeped in that. And then as soon as I could play, I discovered, I remember, I think I was 9 years old, I was crazy for Beethoven. I actually wore out Leonard Bernstein conducting the Ninth Symphony. I wore out the vinyl. I just listened to it over and over and over. My sister bought me a second copy. So things like that were really formative to me. And then, when puberty hit, I was a very serious rock and roll player. And as I think you were, maybe, I don't know, maybe this happened to most of us, I don't know, it happened to me. And this was great. This was a great experience. I mean, there's a real power in rock and roll. It's a very visceral style. And also a lyricism in some of the players that I really borrowed from. And then when I went, later in high school, I heard jazz, and that became it. My whole thing was, all the while classical is a stream that's keeping going. I was still studying classical the whole time, but I was a very serious bebop player. In fact, I moved to LA to be a session guy, a fusion and bebop player, and quickly decided that I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write. But all those styles are very much alive for me, from American classical music. To me, I was always influenced by Copland, the spaciousness with which he'd put together ideas that really affected me, because it works very well on guitar, these very open kind of sonorities and using space that way. I mean, on and on and on, these things.
Yeah, great. Well, speaking of classical music and classical guitar, I'm just curious if you could, each of you, name any, 1, 2, or 3, or 4, or whatever, classical pieces that you studied as a student, or you performed as when you started as a professional, that really influenced you or made you think, ooh, I like what this guy's doing, that that just had an effect on you in your composition or in any way? David, you want to?
Britain Nocturnal. Benjamin
Strange.
Britten, yes, strange. Benjamin
choice,
Britten
but let's move on.
he was a major idol for me. So the fact that he wrote a guitar piece was really important for me.
Right.
Alberto Ginastera, the great sonata that he wrote. I would say the Villalobos 12 Etudes. Those were, there have been other pieces written since that I admire immensely, that I think are great pieces, but those were pieces that were more in my
Seminal
formative
for you.
years.
Yeah. Fred?
The first piece that came to mind when you asked the question, although it should have been the Britain Nocturnal, was the Sonatina by Lennox Barkley.
Right.
And I was assigned that piece as one of my first pieces in college. And I remember, because I had the Julian Bream Art of the Guitar record had just come out, and that was on it. And when I would listen to it, I kind of liked the first movement. It was okay. It was a little modern for me at the time. Even though it's nothing modern about it, really. It's just chords and fourths.
Sure.
But then the second movement had some real dissonances in it. And at that time, we were using recordings, So I would take the needle and I would jump up. I'd say, I don't want to hear that. And I told my teacher I didn't really want to learn it. And he said, no, you need to do this. And eventually, I did learn it.
And who was your teacher at that time?
Leonid Bolotin, who was actually a Russian violinist who started the guitar program at Manus.
Right.
And eventually, it got to the point, I learned it and I performed it, and it got to the point where I stopped playing it because it wasn't dissonant enough.
Right.
So within a few years, my taste had changed greatly.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I have answers for you for that question.
Do you really?
Yeah, because I would say John Dowland.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So you remember more about that
Yeah,
part
yeah.
of my life than I do.
Guion.
Well, farewell,
Yeah,
Dowland,
yeah.
for one. Speaking of Dowland.
When did you learn it? What do you remember?
Maybe I think I was like 19 or something like that. But,
What was it about it? I mean, can you articulate it?
a lot of that Dowland music is just so richly melancholy. It's just about being depressed, kind of, for me, and all the beauty that comes out of depression, and death and joy and death
Right.
and joy, and let's see, what else? I was, really a Bach nut and still am,
Yeah.
So when I first heard Segovia's Chaconne, that was big. I actually did my whole senior independent study at San Francisco Conservatory on that piece, and
Great.
did my own transcription, and just got really heavily immersed
Right.
into that. Lou Harrison's Serenade is
The
one of
five
them.
movement ceremony or the little one?
Sorry, waltz for
Yeah.
not serenade,
Yeah.
waltz for Evelyn Henriksen. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a really kind of precious, memorable piece for me. And I've worked with Duchamp a lot, so a lot of his music, of course, I guess we're not talking just Americans anymore, but
No, just your classical guitar rep that
his Raggett No. 2 was one that I studied really, really heavily, got a lot out of, and the Sonata by Jose
Oh yeah, sure.
big one for me. The kind of impressionist qualities that came out of his writing, I thought were really special, in terms of guitar composers that stood out. So.
Great. Andrew.
Yeah, for me, primarily Bach. I remember learning the Prelude, Fugue, and Allegro, and the Fugue in particular, showed me the potential of polyphony, like the level that polyphony could reach. When it became clear to me, I was just amazed and still am. Also, the Little Fugue in G minor, doing that in guitar in A minor, that just is still one of my favorite pieces. It's so charismatic, yet almost mathematically perfect. Those kind of things really, they still turn my head around. Also, Renaissance music. I just love the music of Dowland and Bird and Morley, and just there's something, the lilt in it, the lyricism and the melodic quality, and those turns of phrase that now are old enough the harmonic moves at the end of phrases sound fresh again. It's like it was standard then, but
Yeah.
a little bit, that's the way they move now. It begins to sound almost new when you use those in your writing a little bit. I don't know, all those things are great influences.
Great, great. I want to ask, because I know we have a lot of young guitar players in the audience, and that coming from high schools or just guitarists that want to write in general, that what do you say to someone who says to you, oh geez, I would love to compose, I just don't know where to start, or I don't, how do I do it? Do I study with someone? What would be your answer to somebody, you know?
Well, often what I tell a student, I actually just did this recently, I'll tell them to write a theme, and then we'll talk about the writing of that theme and getting it really good, and then I'll say, okay, now make variations on it. Because all of composition, to some extent, is variation. So if you start with that, that skill of varying something and knowing how to vary well and concisely and motivically connected and so on, that's a very good skill to develop. That's where I would go.
Right, great.
I find often guitarists, because it is a very noodly instrument,
Yeah.
so guitarists are coming in and they said, I have this thing, but they haven't written it down. And in fact, they've never tried to write
Right.
anything down. So the first thing I tell them is to write it down. And that is often a challenge right there. They have no idea what that looks like on paper. So, and I help them with that.
Right.
The next thing sort of along what you're saying, David, is that I remember someone telling me when I was studying composing, they said, well, ideas are a dime a dozen. It's how you develop them, right? So usually young composers have a lot of ideas, and they're jumpy. Once they get an idea out, so, well, I got to do something else. Here's another idea, and
Right,
another idea.
yeah.
So we just talk about, like, if you've got 2 or 3 ideas, that's a piece right there, or maybe just one idea. So that's sort of the direction we go.
Great. Gian.
Well, yeah, just along those lines to to emphasize the importance of writing them down and periodically sifting through and seeing what you've written down, review that material, because sometimes you can write something down, you can be frustrated that nothing's really going anywhere, but you forget that you actually have a lot of little snippets that might be really useful
Right.
in some regard. They might be completely unrelated, but if they're worth writing down, great. And if when you review them, they're worth keeping, then even better. Because sometimes it takes a few days, and then you come back to it and go, oh, that's garbage. I don't know why I wrote that down. But and the other thing is, while you're reviewing those ideas and maybe you're developing them and working with them, just to keep in mind that it doesn't really matter if it turns out to be a masterpiece or not, because I think the most important thing about composition is to remember that it's just a process, and it's a journey, and it might turn out to be garbage, it might turn out to be some kind of masterwork, but unless you give yourself the freedom and have the confidence to roll with it, you'll never find out.
Right, that's beautiful. Yeah. Andrew.
Well, if a student comes to me asking about composition, I discourage them immediately and tell them they should pursue a line of work that'll make them more money, because
Yes.
music is terrible. But if they're perverse in their insistence, I'll tell them things like, I think developing the ear is one of the best things you can do, because I think what draws many musicians toward composing is they have a very fine, discriminating ability to hear relationships between notes and chords. There's a richness, an emotional richness there that I think we all perceive, and that draws us to composition, because it's an endless palette of emotion. So one thing I tell students to do is just on autopilot, wherever you are, do harmonic analysis. Like there's music everywhere. You can't get away from it. You're in an elevator, in a taxi, whatever. If there's any music, just listen to it and see what kind of information you can get. Is it going 1 to 5? What chords are being used? And every time it repeats, as in the pop world, and it inevitably will, you just try and get a little more information with each pass. Things like that. If you just spend your time listening to music in an analytical way to take it apart, that's so beneficial as a composer, because you need those skills if you're going to create music. You have to know how music's put together. So for me, I can't not do this. I can't sleep if there's music on. It has to be turned off, because I can't stop analyzing it. So I encourage other people in this obsession if they want to be composers.
Wow, great. I fear that we're getting down to the wire. Do I have time for one more, Nancy? One? Okay. Just quickly, this is a tough one at the end, but just tell us tonight something about how you came about picking these pieces that you're playing tonight. I'll start with Andy. It's a tough one. You had 20 minutes. And yeah.
Easy. It's all the pieces I can play well right now, I hope. That's what I've been touring for a while. So.
Good answer, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I can play these pieces well, or not, but it'll be good practice doing it tonight. So.
Yeah.
It's hard to top those two answers because I actually identify with both of them.
Yeah, say no more. Yeah.
I will say no more.
I'm not sure. I think I almost immediately thought I wanted to play one solo piece and one chamber piece because I think most of my best music for the guitar really is written as chamber music with other instruments. So I chose a piece to play with Tara O'Connor, who's one of the great flutists in the world, and this is a piece that I'm very fond of. And a solo piece, Labyrinths, along with my piece Nel Mezzo, the sonata, is probably my two best solo guitar pieces. So
Great. I'm glad you feel that way. Is there Fred, you didn't say much. Is there anything on your program that you really dislike that you're playing?
Yeah, the first two pieces I hate.
Okay, good. I think that's a good way to go about it. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you so much. This has just been a total joy. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks. Thank you.